The sun rose like a blade over the desert, slicing the horizon with a glare that promised heat and violence. The land breathed dust and silence, save for the buzz of flies circling what had died the night before. Vultures wheeled above the ridge, their shadows sliding across the cracked earth like dark omens. The West was not a place of mercy, it was a ledger, and every man's worth was measured in blood, bone, and fear. Jared Cole rode slow, his horse staggering under the weight of a man who hadn't slept in days. His boots clinked against the stirrups, spurs dulled but still sharp enough to catch the light. He wore his coat loose, the hem frayed from years of war and wandering. His revolver hung heavy on his hip, not polished, not proud, just necessary, like a crutch for a broken man. He had once marched under flags, listened to drums thunder like judgment, and watched friends die screaming in smoke. Those ghosts followed him now, settling into every pause between his breaths. He drank to keep them quiet, but this morning he was dry, lips cracked, tongue heavy. Dust Creek appeared ahead, a town crouched against the desert like a man shielding himself from a blow. Wooden buildings leaned into the wind, windows broken, roofs patched with tin that rattled when the air stirred. A single church bell, rusted and mute, stood beside a crooked steeple. In the center square hung gallows, weather-worn but ready. Jared's eyes narrowed. Towns that kept their gallows polished were towns where men died quick and often. He dismounted outside the saloon, boots sinking into powdery earth. The sign creaked overhead, letters faded. Inside, the air was thick with whiskey, sweat, and resignation. Men hunched over cards, women painted smiles that fooled no one, and a piano sat silent in the corner, its keys missing like teeth. Jared ordered a drink, the barkeep eyeing him with a suspicion reserved for drifters. The saloon doors slammed open. Dust blew in with a handful of riders. Their laughter was loud, cruel, and it cut through the room like glass. These were Maddox's men. Jared didn't need the whispers to know it. They carried themselves like wolves in a pen full of sheep, boots heavy, spurs jangling, rifles slung without care. One of them tossed a coin at the barkeep and ordered whiskey for all, then grabbed the nearest man by the collar and shoved him against the wall. Nobody protested. Nobody even looked up. Fear was the coin of this place, and it had been spent too long. Jared drank slow, eyes lowered, but ears open. The talk was of Elias Maddox, the ranch leader who owned the land, the water, and the law. A man who could burn a farm in daylight and call it justice. Jared had seen such men before, always smiling, always certain no one would stop them. The gunfire came sudden, sharp as a whip crack, from outside. Screams followed. Chairs scraped as men scrambled, but none went to the door. Jared rose, glass still half full, and pushed through the swing doors into the blinding light. On the street, smoke curled from a burning barn at the edge of town. A rancher lay in the dust, chest open from a shotgun blast, his wife shrieking as she clutched what was left. Maddox's riders were circling, firing shots in the air, laughing. One man dragged a young woman by the hair, her child wailing in the dirt. The sheriff stood nearby, hat tipped low, saying nothing. Jared's hand twitched near his revolver. He told himself to walk away, that it wasn't his fight. The war had taken enough from him, he was done fighting battles that weren't his. But then the rider yanked the child up by the arm and the woman screamed. Something in Jared broke. His boots moved before his mind gave permission. He strode forward, voice hard as gravel. "Let her go." The laughter stopped. The man holding the child turned, grin crooked. "Who the hell are you?" Jared's answer was a blur of movement. His revolver cleared leather, a single shot cracking the still air. The rider dropped, chest caved in, dust rising as his body hit. Silence fell heavy for a heartbeat, then the street exploded in noise, shouts, hooves pounding, more guns coming up. Jared ducked behind a trough, firing again. A rider toppled from his saddle, another cursed as a bullet tore through his hat. Horses reared, townsfolk screamed, the widow dragged her child into the shelter of a doorway. Gunpowder stung the air, acrid and hot. Jared's heart pounded, every shot dragging him back to fields of smoke and mud where men screamed in rows. He gritted his teeth, fired again, and again. The fight was brutal, fast. Jared's coat tore, a bullet carving his sleeve, another nicking his cheek. He rolled, dust choking him, then came up with his revolver steady. Another rider fell. The last two turned tail, spurring their horses down the street, cursing as they vanished in a trail of dirt. Jared stood, chest heaving, revolver still hot in his grip. The street was littered with bodies, smoke still rising from the burning barn. People peered out from windows, whispers rustling like dry leaves. The sheriff shuffled forward, pale beneath his hat. "You shouldn't have done that." A new voice cut through, calm, amused. "No, Sheriff. He should have." Jared turned. From the haze of smoke came a man on horseback, tall, broad-shouldered, his black coat clean despite the dust. His eyes were pale as glass, his smile sharp as a knife. Elias Maddox himself. He dismounted slow, boots striking the ground with deliberate weight. He looked at Jared as if measuring a horse for purchase. Then he laughed, low and easy. "You've got iron in you, stranger. But you just signed your death warrant." Jared said nothing. His revolver was heavy, his throat dry, his pulse still racing from the fight. Maddox's smile widened. He tipped his hat, turned back toward his horse, and mounted with a practiced ease. "Enjoy your drink, soldier. It'll be your last." The riders gathered the wounded, the dead, and the threat hung heavier than the smoke. The townsfolk shrank back into their homes, doors slamming, shutters closing. Jared stood alone in the street, revolver cooling in his hand, dust settling around his boots. He knew then that whatever peace he thought he'd carried with him into Dust Creek had died the moment he pulled the trigger. He had drawn blood, and Maddox would come for more. The widow clutched her child, whispering thanks with trembling lips, but Jared hardly heard. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon where Maddox had vanished, the weight of choice pressing hard against his chest. He could ride out tonight, disappear before the noose tightened. Or he could stay and fight, knowing it would drag him back into the war he thought he'd left behind. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke and iron. Jared holstered his revolver, jaw tight. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew the war had found him again, and this time there was no running. The sun climbed higher, bleaching Dust Creek in a hard, merciless light. Smoke from the burned barn lingered like a stain that no wind could erase. The townsfolk went about their day in silence, eyes lowered, voices hushed, every step heavy with fear. Jared felt it press on him, thick and suffocating, as though the entire town had been buried under the shadow of one man's will. Elias Maddox did not need chains or prisons to hold them, he had broken them from the inside out. Jared sat in the saloon, whiskey burning down his throat, watching through the dusty window as men hauled away the dead. His hands were steady, but his chest carried the old tremor, the one that rose after the fighting stopped, when silence made memory sharper. He saw his war again, trenches filled with mud, the gasping faces of comrades who had trusted him to lead them home. He had failed them, and he had sworn never to carry that burden again. Yet here he was, revolver still smelling of powder, his soul already bound to another fight. Clara entered quietly, her daughter clinging to her skirts. She carried the weight of gratitude and fear both, eyes darting around the room before fixing on him. "You didn't have to save us," she said, voice low, steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I didn't do it for thanks." Jared's voice was rough, scraped raw from smoke and whiskey. He looked away, unwilling to hold the gaze of a woman who reminded him too much of what he had once lost. "You think you can ride out and forget this place?" she asked. "Maddox won't forget you. None of us will. The others hide because they're too scared, but you—" she stopped, searching his face for something he wasn't sure he had left. "If you won't fight for us, who will?" Her daughter peeked at him with wide, unblinking eyes too old for a child who should have only known laughter. Jared swallowed hard and turned back to his glass. He wanted to tell her he was no savior, that he had nothing left to give, but the words died in his throat. That night, the town gathered in the square, forced by Maddox's men to watch justice served his way. A rancher accused of withholding payment was dragged onto the gallows, rope looped around his neck while the sheriff read out a mock charge. The crowd stood silent, no one daring to intervene. Jared stood among them, fists clenched, jaw tight. When the trapdoor fell and the man dropped, a choked gasp rippled through the people, but not a soul moved. Maddox's enforcers smiled at the silence, satisfied that fear still held. The next day, violence returned like a storm. In the saloon, a young cowboy barely more than a boy was cornered by two of Maddox's riders. They slapped him, mocked him, poured whiskey over his head. The boy tried to fight back, fists flying, but they threw him into a table, laughing as he crawled through broken glass. "Cheer, damn you," one of them barked, waving his revolver at the onlookers. "Show your respect to Maddox's law." The saloon stayed frozen, every eye fixed to the floor. Jared sat in the corner, silent, until the boy coughed blood and whispered for help. Something inside him snapped. He rose with slow purpose, spurs clinking, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. The laughter faltered. "That's enough," Jared said, voice flat, cold. One of the riders sneered. You again. You just don't learn, do you? The gunfight was over before it began. Jared's revolver barked once, smoke curling from the barrel as the man crashed back against the bar. The second fumbled his weapon, but Jared closed the distance, smashing him into the wall, revolver pressed against his jaw. "Run," he said, calm as stone. The man bolted, leaving his partner bleeding in the sawdust. The room held its breath, then released it in a long, shuddering exhale. The boy looked at Jared with wide, frightened eyes, but managed a nod of thanks before staggering out. Jared holstered his gun and sat again, but there was no more drinking that night. He knew Maddox would not let this pass. Later, in the quiet after the storm, Jared found himself in the company of Doc Harper. The old man smelled of whiskey and tobacco, his humor bitter but sharp. "You keep this up, Cole, you'll have the whole damn town either burying you or building you a statue." "I don't want either," Jared muttered. Doc snorted. "Want don't matter. Folks here are starving for someone with a backbone. You showed yours." Maddox noticed. "So did they." He tapped ash from his cigar and leaned close. "Just don't start thinking you can save everybody. The graveyard's already full of men who tried." Jared let the words settle, heavy and unwanted. Yet he couldn't ignore the look in Clara's eyes, or the trembling hands of the boy he had saved. The town was desperate for more than silence. That desperation turned to terror within days. Maddox rode into Dust Creek with 20 men, their horses trampling dust like thunder. He stood in the street, coat black against the noon glare, voice carrying without effort. "Any ranch that won't pay will burn. Any man that resists will hang." And this stranger, his eyes locked on Jared, pale fire in their depths, "will die screaming." The order was given, and fire followed. Ranch houses at the edge of town went up in flames, smoke curling into the sky like a black banner. Families fled, coughing and weeping, chased by riders who laughed as they fired into the air. Maddox had declared war, and the town bowed lower than ever. Jared watched the smoke rise, his stomach hollow, his chest burning. He wanted to leave, to mount his horse and ride until the horizon swallowed him, but every scream twisted deeper into his gut. Clara stood beside him, her daughter clutched close, both staring at him not with fear but with pleading. He realized then that war had come whether he chose it or not. His silence would damn them as surely as Maddox's flames. He could no longer drift on the edge of other men's battles. The line had been drawn, and Dust Creek waited to see if he would cross it. The wind carried the sound of burning timber, the smell of charred wood and flesh. Jared's hand brushed the grip of his revolver, his decision still unspoken, but in the set of his jaw and the fire in his eyes, the answer had already begun to take shape. The days that followed turned Dust Creek into a camp of whispers and watchful eyes. The smell of charred wood still drifted on the wind, clinging to the town like a curse. Jared walked its streets with the weight of silent judgment pressing against him. Every face he passed seemed to ask the same question without words. Would he lead, or would he abandon them? He had never been a leader by choice. Command in the war had been thrust upon him when others fell, and though he had done what was needed, every order still echoed in the screams of the men he lost. But Maddox was burning away the luxury of indecision. Ranches that once dotted the land now stood as smoldering ruins, blackened skeletons against the horizon. Families huddled in town with nothing left but fear and hunger. Clara brought Jared scraps of bread when she could, her daughter offering him a smile that was more hopeful than he felt he deserved. He avoided her eyes, though at night he caught himself listening for the sound of her voice, a reminder that there was something in this town worth defending. It began in secret. A handful of ranchers, shoulders slumped but eyes still burning, gathered in an empty barn. Jared stood at the front, arms crossed, uneasy under their gaze. They looked at him not as a stranger now, but as a man who had drawn blood against Maddox's riders. He cleared his throat, voice quiet but firm. "If you want to survive, you'll need to fight. Maddox won't stop. He only understands one language." The men shifted, murmurs of doubt passing between them. One of them spat in the dust. "We're farmers, not soldiers." "So was I," Jared answered, his tone like gravel. "Until I had to be something else." He opened his coat, revealing the revolver at his side, the scars across his chest. "You learn, or you die. And if you die, you take your families with you. That's the truth." Silence hung for a moment, then a grizzled rancher named Barnes stepped forward, jaw tight. "Then teach us." Jared nodded once, though the agreement settled like a stone in his gut. He had sworn never to lead again, but here he was, shaping farmers into fighters, mothers into sentries, boys into men who would pick up rifles before they were ready. The barn became their refuge, their forge. He showed them how to move quiet through canyons, how to set ambushes in arroyos, how to shoot not just at targets but at shadows that would shoot back. Every lesson carried the smell of gunpowder and the memory of his war. The first ambush came days later, at a narrow canyon where Maddox's riders moved cattle stolen from the ranchers. Jared lay in the dust with Barnes and 3 others, rifles aimed from the rocks above. The sun beat down mercilessly, sweat rolling into their eyes. Jared whispered sharp, clipped words, "Wait. Don't fire until I do." The riders came laughing, oblivious, dust rising around their horses. Jared's breath slowed. His finger tightened. The first shot cracked like lightning, a rider thrown backward from his saddle. Chaos erupted. Ranchers fired, echoes slamming off the canyon walls. Horses screamed, bullets sparked against stone, dust turned red. It was over in minutes, the ground littered with the groaning and the dead. Barnes stared at his trembling hands, rifle still smoking. Jared clapped his shoulder, eyes grim. "You did what you had to." Word spread quickly. For the first time in years, Maddox's men were not untouchable. Townsfolk whispered in doorways, hope flickering where only fear had lived. Jared hated the way they looked at him, as though he were salvation carved from flesh and steel. He knew better. Salvation was always bought in blood, and there was never enough to pay the full debt. One night, Clara found him by the fire behind the saloon. He sat with his head bowed, whiskey untouched at his side. She knelt across from him, her daughter already asleep inside. "They believe in you," she said softly. "They shouldn't," Jared muttered. His voice broke slightly, but he steadied it. "I've buried more men than I've saved. That's what following me gets you." Clara reached across the firelight, her hand brushing his. "Maybe it's time you save us instead of running from what you've lost." Her eyes glimmered, steady and unflinching. For a heartbeat, Jared allowed himself the warmth of her touch, the fragile hope in her voice. It terrified him more than any bullet. The war with Maddox grew darker. For every victory, there was a price. One evening, Jared led a small band to strike at Maddox's supply wagon. The fight was quick, brutal, their ambush successful. But in the retreat, Hank, the old gunslinger who had reluctantly joined them, was shot through the chest. Jared dragged him to cover, blood soaking his hands as Hank wheezed a laugh. "Told you, Cole. Undertaker's been waiting on me." Jared pressed hard, rage boiling in his throat. "Stay with me." But Hank shook his head, eyes glassy. "You ain't a ghost anymore, boy. You're the one keeping us alive. Don't forget that." His last breath rattled, then stilled, leaving Jared staring at another man lost because of his orders. The next morning, the town buried Hank on the hill, the sound of shovels dull against the earth. Jared stood apart, fists clenched, jaw locked tight. He felt the eyes of the people on him, their grief mixed with trust, their fear tempered by the stubborn spark of resistance. Maddox had given them no choice but to fight, and Jared had become the hammer in their hands. That night, as the campfires burned low and the town held its breath, Jared saddled his horse. He did not speak to Clara, though he felt her watching from the shadows. The moon hung pale over the desert as he rode out alone, revolver heavy on his hip, Hank's words echoing in his chest. Maddox had taken too much, and the only way forward was through blood. The ranch loomed on the horizon, its black silhouette sharp against the stars. Jared slowed his horse, heart steady now, his mind carved clear by loss and rage. He had trained them, armed them, given them reason to hope. But this last step, this was his burden alone. The war was no longer just survival. It was a reckoning, and it would end where Maddox reigned. The night was brittle with silence, every sound sharpened under the cold moonlight. Jared rode hard until the fences of Maddox's ranch stretched before him, a black skeleton of wood and iron that cut the desert into forbidden ground. The place loomed like a fortress, barns sprawling, windows glowing faint with lamplight, sentries patrolling the yard with rifles slung loose but ready. The air smelled of manure, smoke, and the faint copper tang of fear that hung wherever violence had been too long at home. Jared dismounted, leaving his horse in the shadows of a mesquite grove. He checked his revolver, each chamber full, then slid his knife into his belt. His breath was steady, his eyes harder than stone. He had come not for justice but for reckoning. He moved with the silence of a predator. Boots pressed soft into dust, body low, every step calculated. A sentry crossed his path, yawning, rifle dangling. Jared struck fast, the knife slashing once, clean and final. The man crumpled without a sound, swallowed by darkness. Jared dragged the body into shadow and kept moving, each kill bringing back echoes of the war, fields littered with the quiet dead, his hands slick with the weight of decisions no man should carry. Yet tonight he felt none of the guilt. Tonight it was purpose. He reached the main yard where horses shifted nervously, sensing danger. Maddox's men were inside, their laughter rolling out through the thin walls, careless, drunk on their own cruelty. Jared slipped through a side door into the barn, his revolver raised. The smell of hay mixed with gun oil. 2 men sat at a table playing cards. Jared's first shot cracked the silence, tearing through the chest of the man closest. The second spun around, mouth open to shout, but Jared's next bullet shattered his throat. The sound of bodies hitting the floor was drowned by the stampede of boots as the ranch erupted into chaos. Doors burst open, shouts rang out, torches flared. Jared ducked into shadow, reloaded quick, then stepped out firing. His shots were cold and precise, one to drop a man on the porch, another to send a torch clattering, flames licking up the wall. The yard turned into a battlefield. Bullets screamed through the night, sparks jumping from metal, wood splintering under the storm. Jared moved like a man carved from war itself, rolling, firing, striking, each action brief and brutal. His body remembered what his soul despised, but it kept him alive as the ground grew red. Then Maddox stepped into the firelight. He was calm, deliberate, his black coat untouched by the panic. His pale eyes found Jared across the yard and narrowed with the pleasure of recognition. "I knew you'd come," he called, voice carrying easily over the chaos. "Death's been following you a long time, Cole. Tonight, it catches up." The fighting around them seemed to fade as both men closed the distance, revolvers drawn, every step echoing with the inevitability of the duel. Maddox smirked, the kind of smile that had broken men long before his bullets did. Jared said nothing, only leveled his revolver, his jaw set with iron resolve. The world held its breath. Then both fired. The crack split the night, flames leaping higher. Maddox staggered but did not fall, his shot grazing Jared's arm, blood blooming through his sleeve. Jared pressed forward, firing again, another shot striking Maddox's side, but the ranch leader was a bull of a man, fueled by rage and arrogance. He roared, lunged, and they collided in a storm of fists, boots, and grit. The revolvers went skidding across the dirt. Maddox's fist smashed into Jared's jaw, sending him sprawling. Dust filled his mouth, the taste of iron and earth. Maddox was on him in an instant, boots grinding into his chest, fists raining down. Jared blocked, twisted, drove his knife upward, but Maddox caught his wrist, forcing the blade away, their muscles straining like bent steel. "You're no different than me," Maddox snarled, spittle spraying, his pale eyes wild. "You kill, you burn, you lead men to graves. Only difference is I don't lie about what I am." Jared gritted his teeth, strength surging through him as he shoved back. "I fight for the living." His words were a growl, each syllable dragged from the depths of every loss he carried. With a desperate surge, he wrenched free, slamming the knife into Maddox's chest. The ranch boss's eyes went wide, his breath choking out in a harsh rattle. He staggered, clawing at the blade, then crumpled into the dirt, his body twitching once before falling still. The yard fell quiet save for the crackle of fire and the groans of the wounded. Maddox's men, seeing their leader broken, threw down their weapons or fled into the night. The air hung heavy with smoke, gunpowder, and the raw finality of death. Jared stood over Maddox's body, chest heaving, his arm bleeding, but his eyes were steady. The war was over, not the war he had carried for years, but the one that had finally found him in Dust Creek. By dawn, the ranchers and townsfolk had gathered, watching as the ranch smoldered. Families reclaimed stolen cattle, freed prisoners, and raised their heads for the first time in years. The sheriff tossed his badge into the dirt and walked away, his silence broken at last. Jared stood apart, hat low, coat torn, blood dried on his skin. Clara approached, her daughter clutching her skirts, eyes wide with cautious hope. "You gave us back our home," Clara said, her voice soft, weighted with gratitude and something deeper. Jared shook his head. "You gave it back to yourselves. I just showed you how." Her daughter reached for him, tiny fingers brushing his scarred hand. For a moment, Jared allowed himself the warmth of it, a fragile promise of something beyond war. But he knew he could not stay. The town would rebuild, and it would need leaders who belonged to it. He was a man made for roads, not roots. As the sun rose, Jared saddled his horse. The people watched in silence, understanding in their eyes. Clara stood with her daughter, both gazes fixed on him, unspoken words hanging in the space between. Jared tipped his hat, a final gesture, then turned his horse toward the horizon. The desert opened before him, endless and empty, the sky vast and merciless. He rode into it without looking back, the memory of Dust Creek burning behind him like a brand. His voice, low and steady, carried on the wind as though speaking not just to himself but to anyone who would listen. The West don't care if you're good or bad. It don't care what scars you carry. It remembers only the ones who stand when others fall. And sometimes, that's enough. The trail stretched on, endless as the hunger for justice in a land that had never known peace. His story was written now, carved in blood and dust, left behind for those who would tell it. And as the horizon swallowed him, the echo of his ride became legend. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Out here in the West, every voice matters, and your story keeps the fire burning.